have with me today Herbert Block, the Executive Director of the American Zionist Movement. I'm Maayan Hoffman, Executive Editor to ILTV, and welcome back to the ILTV News Podcast. And Herbert, welcome for joining us.
Thank you for having me here in the studio.
Of course. Now, Herbert, I said, you are the Executive Director of the American Zionist Movement. We call that AZM. How long have you been leading it, and can you just give me an idea of what this organization is?
Sure. I've been the professional head of the AZM for almost 8 years now. And AZM is the umbrella Zionist federation in the United States. We are both the American arm of the World Zionist Organization. We'll talk a little bit more about that. But we're also an independent organization, an amuta, an NGO in the United States that brings together 46 national Jewish Zionist organizations under our umbrella to work to coordinate among them, to aggregate and amplify their own messages and bring Zionists together in America under one roof for dialogue and cooperation.
So I'm certainly going to want to talk about this word Zionists and Zionism because today it is such a buzzword for better and for worse. But I want to take you back. You mentioned the World Zionist Organization, how you sort of map up to the World Zionist Organization. Explain to me what is the World Zionist Organization and then how AZM fits into that umbrella.
So the World Zionist Organization is one of the legacy organizations of the Jewish people that was founded by Theodor Herzl. We all know the first Zionist Congress in Basel in 1897, and out of that Congress came the Zionist organization to help structure and bring together the Zionist movement around the world. Over the years, the WZO has joined together with the Karen Kayemet L'Yisrael, which was also formed by Herzl, later the Jewish Agency, Karen HaYesod, what are known as the national institutions of Israel, the Mosdot HaLeumim, that bring together Jews in Israel and Jews in the Diaspora, and we'll talk more about the work that is supported by the national institutions. There's a system of Zionist federations around the world through the WZO that work in partnership with the national institutions, representing the Jewish diaspora, world Jewry, global Jewish communities, whatever term you want to use, in the system of the national institutions, and having a diaspora voice in the Zionist Congress, which is the global parliament of the Jewish people. So AZM is the American arm, and we are the Zionist Federation in the United States. Not to boast, but we're by far in America the largest Zionist federations of the ones around the world, and there's almost 40 countries around the world that have a Zionist federation of some size.
Wow, yeah, that was going to be my next question. Like, what are some of the other, like the AZM, what is another example of an AZM in another country? Can you just give me one or two examples?
To the north of it, we have the CZF, they say Z in Canada, the Canadian Zionist Federation. There's I won't try to say the name, the Congreso Zionista in Mexico. There's the Zionist Federation in the UK. There's a body in France. There's in Latin American countries. In South America, in South Africa, and Australia, all around Europe, and there's now even a federation in Uganda and some other countries that have joined. So there's about 40 altogether. Unbelievable.
Now you mentioned this other WZ, but this one was a WZC, the World Zionist Congress, which is a body that I understand is governing, giving out money in some capacity in order to support the causes that are important to Israel and the Zionist community. Explain to me the World Zionist Congress and then how that results from this whole web of Zionist organizations.
We only have 30 minutes.
We only have 30 minutes, but I feel like we need to get these terms down for our listeners and our viewers.
So I won't do 127 years of history, but the Zionist Congress is the parliament of the Jewish people, that it's elected around the world. It's not based on the largest donors. It's really a grassroots convening of representatives of Jewish communities, both Israel and around the world, and it's what was formed by Herzl. And now this year in October we'll meet the 39th Zionist Congress in the same footsteps of Herzl. So people are participating in a bit of the history, and delegates have come together about every 5 years to set the overall tone and direction of the national institutions, which include, as I mentioned, World Zionist Organization, Jewish Agency, Karen Kayemet JNF, and Karen HaYesod. They each have different functions in terms of supporting Zionism and activities in Israel and around the world. For those in America, Karen HaYesod isn't really operating in America at fundraisers around the world. The Jewish Federation system raises money that goes through the Jewish Agency for Israel, and the Karen Kayemen obviously deals with land and development here in Israel. These institutions existed well before the foundation of the State of Israel, but they remain because the Zionist movement, as I understand it from I wasn't there with Herzl, but from his legacy, was designed not just to end with Hakamat Medina, with the establishment of the state in 48, but it was to build the connection between world Jewry and the State of Israel. So the national institutions continue to support Jewish communities around the world, shlichim, Zionist education, Jewish education, schools, communities, and many activities that American Jews are involved with. For example, I'll talk about American, things like Birthright and Masa, and all these projects have connections through the national institutions, and the national institutions also deal with issues that sovereign state of Israel, which is a nation of its own, like other countries, cannot just do only for its Jewish citizens. So or for Jewish citizens around the world. So many of those functions are performed by the Zionist Movement Institute bodies that are still there and have a different role than they did obviously before 48 when they were in the Yishuv, but they are the main connection between the state and world Jewry.
And as you mentioned, every 5 years there's sort of a new agenda, let's call it, that is being set for the next 5 years, and then we reconvene the Congress. And the Congress is based on a number of delegates, which are then elected to be delegates through a international, if I have it correctly, election that takes place. Certainly there's an election that's happening in the United States that's going to be coming up in the next several months. Explain to me about the election process. Who's running? Give me some examples of the slates, and then, by the way, just why does this matter? How does it? Does agenda actually shift based on who gets elected?
Right. So there's a lot to cover there, but let me try to go in.
We can take it in pieces. I just have so many questions.
I know. No, and it's important because these questions, it's good if you understand them and your listeners understand them, then more people will participate. So there's 525 delegates elected worldwide to the Zionist Congress. 152 of them come from the United States, almost a third. 200 of them come from within Israel based on the makeup of the Knesset. So the most recent Knesset election up until 3 months before the Congress. So that would be, as of now, the Knesset as constituted from the election in November of 22. Okay. If there's another Knesset election before the summer, then that would
But what does that mean? They're members of Knesset that then sit as delegates, or they're members of their parties?
Each of the Zionist parties in Israel has seats in the Zionist Congress based on 2 per representative in Israel. So if the Labor Party has 8 seats in the Knesset, I don't know what the number offhand is, they would have 16 seats, for example, in the Zionist Congress. And according to that key, they're not members of the Knesset, but there are others involved in the party, some of whom might have been former members of the Knesset, but they're people involved in the party. So there's 152 elected from the United States, 200 from Israel, and 173 from around the world. Each country has its own system for how they elected. Some countries have elections, or I should say, for how they're selected from each country. Some countries have elections like ours, but on a smaller scale. Some countries have like a convention of Zionists in their country, and the Zionist groups in France, for example, get together and divide up the number of seats or mandates based on sort of the demographics of the community. We have the biggest in America. The election is March 10th to May 4th. In America. Okay. ZionistElection.org is the website where people can find all the information. Keep it simple, ZionistElection.org. It's also on the AZM website, which is azm.org. And you'll see there all the parties that are running, and when the election opens, people can register and vote. Just take us a couple of minutes, primarily online, or smartphone, tablet, computer. There is a paper ballot option if necessary. And there's 21 different parties running in America from a gamut, just like in the AZM, right to left on political views. There are parties of all religious denominations, Reform, Conservative, and a couple of different Orthodox parties. There's a Sephardic party. There's some parties from the Russian-speaking community. This time, for the first time, there's two parties made up primarily of Israeli Americans that are running and engaging in sort of mainstream or establishment Jewish community activities, which the Israeli American community hasn't that traditionally been that involved in. There are some parties that are apolitical, that are just sort of general Zionist parties. There are parties focusing on students. There's a wide range of groups. I don't know. I mentioned two in the Russian-speaking community. So there's a very diverse slate of parties, a very diverse group of slates that are running. People vote for a slate, and it's like a parliamentary election, which may be a little unfamiliar for Americans, because America were used to voting for individuals. Here, you're voting for a party. If the party gets a share to get 10 seats, then the first 10 people are selected as delegates. The next 20 could be alternates, and people come together at the Congress in the end of October. It's October 20th or 30th, and the Congress
2025.
Of 25, and the Congress is somewhat like it has elements of a political convention in America, where if people know the RNC or the DNC, every 4 years you bring together the faithful, you fire them up. They meet people from around the country, in this case from around the world. They set the party platform, and then the government or the party goes on. We say that there's no winners or losers, unlike a parliamentary election where you have a coalition and then an opposition,
right,
and you have the opposition leader in the country.
Whoever gets elected works together.
Everyone works together. Obviously, depending on the makeup of the Congress, based on the parties from around the U.S., Israel, around the world, certain factions of viewpoints, whether it's Likud or the Reform Movement or whatever they may be, will have more or less influence over different departments of the national institutions and their budgets, but everyone gets to play a role, and that's important as a Jewish value and as Zionist value, so there's no one sitting on the outside waiting for the next election to participate.
So fascinating. I'm just thinking about the years when we had let's say a far right or more conservative government here in Israel that took up a lot of seats, and then a very liberal community in the United States. It must have been fascinating to be a fly on the wall in a meeting like that. I have a few more questions just to keep going from what you were talking about. Now, you mentioned Zionist parties. Are there parties that are not Zionist parties then in the government? How do we decide what is a Zionist organization and who gets to run in these elections?
So I don't know exactly how all the Knesset definitions happen and which parties. I know, for example, the Arab parties aren't in the Zionist movement. So I'm not an expert on exactly the Israeli system, but obviously all the parties that declare themselves to be Zionist in Israel are participating in the Israeli side.
And is that the case in America?
In America,
as well?
so everyone has to agree to run. To vote in the election, you have to be 18. You have to be a U.S. citizen or legal permanent resident whose primary residence is in the United States. Jewish, and you have to agree to the Jerusalem program. The Jerusalem program, the Tochnit Yerushalayim, is the Zionist movement platform. It was originally called the Basel Platform of Herzl, and over the years it was renamed after the state was formed. And it's the Zionist movement platform, largely the same text, modernized from the Herzl's days, which is the core beliefs of the Zionist movement, and it's on our website. You can see it as well. And so anyone who's running is agreeing to be in the Zionist movement, and every voter basically is signing that they are agreeing to the Zionist movement principles before they vote. So someone who's a non-Zionist Jew wouldn't participate because it would be going against their values. Unfortunately, there are not that many of them, but all the parties are Zionist. And one of the things that our election shows and the AZM 46-member organization shows is the many ways that one can be a Zionist and how prevalent Zionism is in the American Jewish community. I guess surveys have shown over 90% of people believe in Zionism.
Yeah.
And there's many different ways to be a Zionist. You can be Haredi, you can be liberal, you can be in different streams, you can be young, old, involved in a variety of different causes, and the diversity of slates and diversity of members of AZM shows the commonality and strong belief in Zionism of the American Jewish community, which, when people attack Zionism, or people who are anti-Zionist, they're really anti-Semitic, and they're really attacking the Jewish people.
So I want to stop you for just a minute, because last election, which I guess was 5 years ago,
Right.
only about 150,000, if I remember correctly, people voted in the American election. But there were like 6-7 million Jews living in America, and I would assume that more than half of those are over the age of 18 Jewish. So why are so few people voting, and is this really representative? I'm sorry to ask the hard question, but if so few people are actually taking part in such an election.
Right. So the last time there were 124,000 people who voted.
So even less than 150,000.
But we have reversed the trend where over the prior years, the numbers had gone down. They'd gone down from almost 200,000 over the 2 decades before to, sadly, in 2015, 57,000. And it turned around last time, where more people were engaged. There were 14 parties running last time as opposed to 10 before. Now we have 21. There are more parties and more candidates running. Some of that's due to people being motivated after October 7th. Some of those groups were interested in the Zionist movement were calling us even before. In the prior years, people were talking about other issues in Israel of religion and the state and judiciary and all sorts of issues. And people had very different opinions, and people were getting motivated to get connected. So, we're hopeful there'll be a greater turnout this time. Yes, it's a small amount compared to the overall Jewish community, but it's really getting the activist people involved. It's a system that people aren't accustomed to, voting in a parliamentary election, and there's a $5 fee, which is the traditional Herzl shekel tzionit, to join the Zionist movement, but it also covers the cost of the election and the processing and verification of voters. Each voter can only vote once, and supposed to vote themselves personally and do it only once. It's not like people in America know the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame or the baseball All-Star ballot, where you can vote 25 times a day from 7 emails you have.
There's time for that nowadays, right?
But or you click on your phone all day.
Yeah.
So this is you have to vote once, just like you would in a public election. So it's a system that we hope more people will become familiar with, and then more American Jews will engage in. Of the number of Jews, and different surveys have different amounts. Well, let's say 6 million Jews in America. Not all of them are engaged. Many of them are unaffiliated.
Sure.
So we're hoping that among the affiliated Jews there'll be a greater turnout.
So last question on this, and I want to do want to move into the concept of Zionism, but the World Zionist Congress, as you said, helps to control the purse or the budget of these major national organizations. So talk about why this is very important, because I don't think people really understand that if they don't come out and vote, then where that money is going to get spent is going to be based on the will of the people who did come out and vote.
Right.
And that's actually pretty large sums of money,
Correct.
if I understand correctly, and pretty important sums of money.
So it's over $1 billion a year is spent by the national institutions.
Okay.
The 4 bodies that I mentioned before. So the Zionist Congress isn't voting on the line item budget, but it's electing the leadership of the WZO, Jewish Agency, Karen Kayemet, Karen Yesod, and they, and in turn, the different departments, different divisions, and different priorities. So there have been discussions in the past about funding in Israel versus in Jewish communities, funding for different religious streams, funding whether it's over the green line or not, different priorities of communities around the world and where funds are spent, how much is allocated to different religious streams. So, as you said, in any election, elections have consequences. That's a line in America. Also, people also, see in the American elections, people are our policy, and the people who get elected help shape the policy of the institutions, or whether it's government agencies in the United States or Europe or anywhere, or in the Zionist movement. And so, for people who say, I don't know why I should be involved, or it's a system that it's been around for a long time and we should change the system. Maybe that will happen, or there always opportunities to reform the system. But if you're not in it, then you're letting somebody else, as you said, make those decisions. And we hope that American Jews, whatever their opinion is, will participate and state their voice. We also hope that having a large vote in America will back up and give strength to the entire American delegation. People we obviously have an American delegation of 152 delegates. They'll sit with their own party caucus from delegates around the world, but they also wear the kippah, the hat of of Americans, and we want to strengthen Zionism in the diaspora, so that if there's the more people that voting and our delegation comes in backed by a greater number, the greater the voice of the diaspora community is.
Now let's talk about this term Zionism for a minute. Zionism has really become a very heated word, I would say. In fact, it's become a controversial word, for lack of a better term. Some people are even afraid to be Zionist today, especially given the rise in anti-Semitism, anti-Zionism that we're seeing in the United States specifically, but also around the world. Talk to me a little bit about this term. Why do you think that is? And just for your own self, how do you define Zionism?
So, look, for me, and I think in my definition is what the Zionist movement definition is. I'm not quoting it verbatim; it's in the Jerusalem program, but it's basically, it's the Jewish people's right to self-determination and to have our national homeland in our ancestral land, and to live in safety and security in a Jewish democratic state in Israel. And it's obviously we have a connection to this land that goes back millennia. For those who say, change the word, don't use the word Zionism, it doesn't poll well, whatever. You can't take Zionism out of our people, our tradition. Jews around the world, through good times and bad, for centuries, for millennia, have been talking about Zion, have been praying every day in their tefillot about Zion. So how can we separate Zionism from the Jewish people? It's a core value. It's inspired the Jewish people, for as in the Hatikva, for 2,000 years to return to Zion. So sadly, and I remember as a child when the Zionism as Racism resolution was passed in the UN. Since that time, others have defined Zionism. The Jewish people probably could have done a better job of reclaiming that word, claiming it, and not letting other people define it as some kind of racism or colonial enterprise. The Zionist movement is not against any other people. It wants to work with our neighbors. It's about the Jewish people having the same rights here in the land of Israel that other nations have, and in our homeland that we're connected to, that since the time of the Tanakh, since the time of the Bible. So for us, Zionism is a core part of being Jewish. I think everyone in the Zionist movement agrees on that. They may have very different views on policies, on borders, on where you pray and how you pray, and different issues. But everybody is a Zionist, and that drives us. In these times of war in the last year and a half, many people put aside the differences to focus on all the things that unite us, not divide us, and we can have unity without unanimity or uniformity. The Jewish people have always been a quarrelsome people, but that commitment and that quarreling, as it were, gives us a strength to reinforce our beliefs. So, we think that the Zionism, while it has been under attack, in the last year we've seen more and more people coming back to Zionism, more and more people joining Zionist movements, people standing up for Zionists or saying, yes, I am a Zionist, when they might not have used that term, and they realize, sadly, when Zionism under attack, and you see how it's, every day, when Hamas releases the terrorists, sadly, they're attacking Zionism, and they're not, they're attacking us as the Jewish people and the Jewish state, and I think that's helped to bring people back to the term and back to the community.
So, Herbert, you were here in the country for the Conference of Presidents 50th anniversary event. They had a mission here to Israel. There was about 65 delegates, smaller number of delegates than historically. In fact, it was one of the smaller missions, probably, though, in part because of how many missions have taken place since the war on October 7th. So people have been here. One of the striking things that came out was the sheer number of women that took part in the Conference of Presidents. It was more than there's ever been, and also more in terms of percentages, that it was more than 50% female. And speaking to some of the leadership of the female organizations, they said, well, it's not 100% reflective of the American Jewish community per se. There are still, most of the larger organizations are still being run by men, but we are seeing kind of a groundswell of women taking up these leadership roles. Are you seeing that in the Zionist movement as well? And how do you think, if so, how is that going to impact, if you think it will, the dialogue that happens around the table?
So the Zionist movement has always been inclusive of women. Women had the right to vote at the Second Zionist Congress in 1898, 20 some odd years before the suffrage movement in America. And I think there was only, at the time in 1898, there was only one country, New Zealand, that allowed women to vote. So the Zionist movement has been a progressive movement in terms of women's inclusion. There were women delegates even at the first Zionist Congress, and by the second one, they had full voting rights. So the Zionist movement has always included women. Obviously, there have been great leaders like Golda Meir and Henrietta Zold in the early years. The WZO has a rule on including women in the organizations and the slates. It was for many years 30% of the delegates to Congress had to be women. Last year it was actually increased to 40%.
Wow.
So that's a
That's
rule
a big
that
deal,
every
yeah.
party, no matter what their ideology, has to have 40% of women, and
Wow.
they have to be spaced out. You can't just put them all at the end of the list. There's actual rules about all this, and we check to make sure. There's also rules that 25% of all delegates have to be age 35 or younger, so that there is a built-in system for cultivating the next generation of leaders. So there are many women involved. AZM has our lay president right now, Deborah Isaac, is the first woman president in 50 years. My predecessor was there for 3 decades, was a woman. So we've had women leadership in the AZM for a long time. Actually, I think the Conference of Presidents, my sense was that there were more people in general this year than
I'm told the number was less
last year. There were, but there were. I think this year the Conference of Presidents delegation overall had a majority of women participants.
Correct.
Which I think is a positive step. We want the full breadth of the Jewish community to be represented, lay and professionally, both in organizations of Jewish life like the Conference of Presidents and others, as well as in AZM and the Zionist movement.
So, one of the questions that I think that is important when we talk about this leadership, though, is actually the impact that they are having. We talked about the budget, this $1 billion plus that is being used, during the year is being allocated now by a world delegation, a large American delegation, which is part of the world, and the Israeli delegation. I have to question the influence of the Americans or the Jewish leaders in the diaspora in general here in the state of Israel. One of the things that struck me pretty strongly during the Conference of Presidents was how affluent and well-connected these Jewish leaders are, and how proud they are to be representing Israel and speaking to world leaders, Arab leaders, very unique leaders around the world. At the same time, it seems like if they have all this influence and they have all these connections, they're working with the president in the previous administration, the Biden administration for sure, also the Trump administration, Arab leaders. Why is it, do you think, that these leaders were not able to, number one, get at least the American Israeli hostages out of Gaza in the last 16 months? Why was that not prioritized? And why do you think that they weren't able to make better or bigger inroads in terms of having a more effective results of this war? Because here we are sitting 16 months later, not even sure if we're going to make it to a phase 2. In the hostage negotiations, there are at least 25 live hostages left in Gaza, and of course many more who have died.
So, which is a tragedy for all of us. I would disagree on the point that you said about it. It wasn't a priority for the American Jewish community. I know that.
Or they weren't effective. It could have been a priority and effective, and then the question is why were they ineffective?
So, influence doesn't necessarily mean, result in the outcome. The Jewish groups, I think, were all across the board were pushing the hostages as basically the number one priority in every meeting and every discussion for the last year and a half.
Okay, but Herbert, I'm not that old, but I do remember, or at least and certainly have read about, for Soviet Jewry, for the Ethiopian Aliyah.
But here's a fundamental, and I was old enough to be involved in some of those things as a child. But in those cases, you were dealing with different things. You were different. The Soviet Union was a communist dictatorship, but it was a nation state that sat in the UN and international bodies. There were diplomatic channels and some norms that people adhered to. Even in the Ukraine-Russia war, there's norms of diplomacy and prisoner trades and things that happened in the midst of war and the conventions on those things like that. We're dealing here with a horrific terrorist state, not terrorist state, a terrorist organization that is acting like a state, but they're a terrorist body that's murderous and heinous and despicable, and negotiating with them through third parties, some of whom are not really friendly either. So it can't be the burden of the Jewish community alone in America, though I'm sure the Jewish community in America and around the world has made this issue number one. you didn't mention the U.S. Congress, but there's been huge efforts in Congress at the UN, which, we sit in New York, 2 blocks from the UN. The UN is a horrible institution in terms of Israel and this issue right now, and has done nothing like many of the other international bodies. But the Jewish community has done, I think, as much as it can. We couldn't control the results of negotiating between U.S., Middle Eastern countries, the Israeli government, and a terrorist organization. So it's a different situation than those movements, and you don't have some of the same leverages that the U.S. government had for Soviet Jewry or Ethiopian Jewry. And so sadly, we are where we're at. It maybe without the U.S. Jewish influence and other organizations around the world, we wouldn't even be where we're at. So it's a tragedy, but the Jewish community has been fairly united in terms of advocacy through the Conference of Presidents, through other organizations independently, pushing for the hostages, pushing for aid to Israel. There's many political factors and other things at play, but the relationships that are there help advance that. There's a lot goes on behind the scenes, so it may not be as speedy or as effective as everyone wants, but the Jewish community has been pushing support for Israel, freedom of the hostages, very strongly.
So we are running out of time, and I just want to ask you, Herbert, in terms of any final sentiments, we can, end this podcast maybe with a note of hope. Is there a final message, especially as we go into a election for a group of delegates that could decide the next 5 years? What is that message of hope that you want to deliver, in the end? So,
elections are contentious and competitive, but this election also is an opportunity for people to stand up, to unite around Zionism, to connect to the community and say, I'm a Zionist. And that's what this election is about, affirming your Zionism, representing your views in the Zionist movement, but ultimately we're all bound together as a Jewish people. Am Yisrael Chai is not just a slogan, but it's the way we live. We in AZM a year ago or a year and a half ago, just before the war, for our conference, adopted a new tagline of Zionism together, and we wanted people to come together as Zionists. There had been a contentious year of debates, and then the slogan of Israel and the Jewish people has been Biachad Natseach, and that's really what we believe in. And people can express their Zionism in many different ways, but come out, participate, express your views, have a say, whether you're young, older generation. This is for the older generation, they remember 48 or the 67. For the younger generation, this is a moment to define Zionism and reclaim Zionism and to stand together as Zionists and united Jewish community.
Beautiful. Well, Herbert Block, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you.